Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Megan, and I'm the marketing director with Concierge Pediatrics. And on behalf of Concierge Pediatrics, welcome to tonight's webinar, and thank you for joining us. We are honored to be led in this educational discussion this evening by Dr. Alexandra Filingeri. If you haven't met Dr. Filingeri yet, she is a registered dietitian and a doctor of clinical nutrition who operates her business, Nutrition by Dr. Alexandra, helping others with weight management, pediatric nutrition, and more. She offers preferred pricing for Concierge Pediatrics members and operates out of our Roslyn and Woodbury offices on Long Island, and she has virtual office hours as well. So tonight, we're here to talk about raising healthy kids, navigating weight, wellness, and your options. So Dr. Phil and Jerry will share some expert insights, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. I know some of you have submitted some questions in advance. We'll do our best to get to all of those. And during the webinar, if you look at the bottom toolbar on your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So you can go ahead and ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to address those at the end during the Q&A portion as well. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Phil and Jerry.
Thank you, Megan. Alrighty, hi guys. So let me just share my screen so we can see my presentation, and then we will jump right in. Let's put in slide show mode from the beginning. Alrighty, so tonight we are going to talk about helping kids grow healthy, and this is a topic that I am very passionate about. But I think that it requires a lot of knowledge so that we can help kids grow healthy nutritionally in a really sustainable way. So that's what we are going to talk about tonight. So Megan already introduced me. My name is Alexandra. I'm a registered dietitian with a doctorate degree in clinical nutrition. I have a private practice where I see patients in person at Concierge, primarily in Woodbury. I also see patients in Roslyn, virtual, and then all around the world, which is a really exciting thing that I get to do. And I'm really focused on healthy growth and development in kids, and then following those kids into adulthood, where I deal a lot with women's health, like PCOS, pregnancy, fertility, perimenopause, and so on. But tonight we are going to talk about children. And I understand when we're talking about raising healthy kids, it becomes almost a confusing topic in the sense of, what is she going to talk about tonight? Is this conversation primarily going to be about weight? Is this conversation going to be nothing about weight? And how do we talk about these issues with children? So let's start by talking about nutrition. And let's just talk about healthy weight in children. So the first thing that we need to understand is the pediatrician is the captain of the ship. So that's why I love working with Concierge Pediatrics, because I have a lot of trust in the captains of the ship, the amazing pediatricians that are at Concierge. And then what the pediatrician will do, and what I do as well as a registered dietitian, is I see growth, and I see growth over time in kids. And how that's typically done is in two ways. The first is with growth curves. And your child will be ranked on the growth curve based off of their height and based off of their weight. We use the 85th percentile to classify overweight, and the 95th percentile to classify obese, and then it goes on from there. But the doctor will also do an in-depth evaluation into blood work and lab values, and we will look at not just weight, because we understand that weight is just merely one number. An interesting fact too is that children tend to have good muscle mass as well. So sometimes weight on the scale isn't even totally reflective of true body composition. But we also get to look at weight, and then we get to look at, or the doctor will look at, lab values, right? So we do know that pediatric obesity translates into adult obesity. And we also know that we're seeing the prevalence of high cholesterol, fatty liver, prediabetes, and so on in younger populations. So the magic in children, in my opinion, is that it's a really formative years where we really can make an impact on children's lives if we educate them with nutritional tools and so on, that we can work in prevention mode. So if we see weight trending in a way that we necessarily may not want it to, or we see lab values going in a way that we may not want it to, we may be able to impact. Now, something to keep in mind, and this is for both pediatrics and for adults, is that overweight and obesity is, one, a medical condition, and two, it is a complex condition, right? So it factors in genetics, family history, It factors in the food environment. It factors in picky eating habits, which I see all the time from my kid patients, and the presence of disordered eating. So depending on where the child is in their growth, especially if they get into those middle school, high school um, years, they start to be influenced by social media and society. So we understand that weight is actually multifactorial, meaning that there's many different things that influence weight, meaning that the care that we have to give for weight has to be quite comprehensive so that we can get the best results possible. And another thing is, this is not, of course, like a pediatric weight loss chat, but it's something to keep in mind when kids start to fall higher on their growth curves, is that children and adolescents are still growing, right? Meaning that adults may be able to put themselves into, a quite caloric deficit and have weight loss. But for children, we are trying to achieve, optimal height, and their bones are still developing and so on. So it becomes a time where we're not focused on restriction, we're focused on getting the right nutrients in for healthy and adequate growth over time. Now, what I want to do tonight is I want to make it really practical, right? I don't want to bore you with science, even though I love science, and I would love to bore you with the science. But I want to talk about what you, as someone that is interested in pediatrics, has children, needs to know. So the first thing is, and this is something that I do with every single patient that comes into my office, is adults and children do better with structure, right? And that's something that I find I understand, the stressors of having, a child that is going from school to after school activities and has ultimate a lot of commitments, but kids do well with structure, right? So what I'm talking about in my sessions is, okay, what do we need to do to make breakfast, lunch, and dinner happen? What do we need to do if the child is having snacks? Make snacks intentional. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I'm really big on intentional snacking, which means there is thought process, right? Oftentimes, what do we do? Either when a child it doesn't eat that much or gravitates to snacks more than food, we find them in a grazing pattern all day. And what happens is calorically, the snacks start to weigh heavier than the meals. So the first thing I encourage with just general healthy eating habits is consistency with meals. The next meal should be predictable. The schedule may be different for family one and family two, but there should be some structure in eating habits. Another important factor, and it kind of touched on it, is there should be intentional space between meals. So, oftentimes I see, and with some of my pediatric patients, is snacks start to blend into dinner time, and then snacks blend from dinner time on, right? So there really isn't proper time to stimulate appetite. And on the other hand, we also can really, calorically be in a big surplus if we have an unintentional grazing pattern that's happening all day. Um, so we want to evaluate the caloric contribution of snacks as well as the caloric contribution of meals, if that's something. We're not counting calories in kids, but I always say that your meal should be more than your snacks, and that's something that I see in pediatrics is sometimes tends to be the opposite. Um, so we really want to get kids involved, and we want to get them involved at any age that they are cognitively aware, to get involved. So I mean, I have 2 and 3 year olds that I work with, where getting them involved is more hands-on, versus when they're older, it's more getting them involved from a cognitive standpoint, getting them into the supermarkets, asking them for more preference on what are the foods that are going to be served, trying to spark what is their interest, and essentially, if they're old enough, how much skin in the game do they have when it comes to their nutrition, right? Oftentimes nutrition counseling is about getting the person ready for change. So you may be saying, you don't know my kid. My kid is going to fight me if I try and make changes. And it's really, having those conversations that slowly shift over time so that their readiness to make dietary changes there. Um, Oftentimes, getting the family involved, it can be motivating where the whole family ends up eating more balanced plates. Siblings can serve as positive role models if you have one really good eater and one not so great eater. So sometimes we can use that. And I think the most important thing is, understanding where your child is. And developing age-appropriate portion sizes. And that's something that, we could definitely in the future talk a little bit more on. But the summary of making it practical, and I'll kind of simplify what I said, is we need structure and routine. We need meals to be meals. We need snacks to be snacks. And we need to get the child to whatever level they are willing and able, which it could be super low or it could be much higher, involved in their care, get them excited in their care. Oftentimes, and it breaks my heart to hear, I was really struggling and I brought my kid to see a nutrition professional and it didn't go well. And we need to make health for children a very positive experience that they want to participate in versus a negative one where they feel like they're having things that are being taken away. So this is something, and I know we even had questions on this tonight, and I think it's very, very valuable to talk about is how do I talk to my child about making dietary change? Oftentimes parents call me and they say to me before they bring the child into my office, I know how to cook, I know how to prep, but I don't know how to talk to my child about making nutritional changes because I don't want it to come off um, wrong. I don't want it to come off like diet culture. I don't want it to come off like restriction. And quite frankly, I don't know what to say. And what I like to say to them is wording matters, right? So we have to once again speak their language and spark their interest. So I just gave some slogans that I tend to say oftentimes in my practice to the patients that I see. So things like healthy food gives you energy, right? So relating it to how the food feels in their body and how they feel after, making a good choice or connecting to their fullness level, not feeling overfull. Food, does this food make your tummy feel good? This is going to help you grow big and strong, or this is going to help you excel at the sport that you're playing in. Um, or these are really good habits. How do you feel about these habits? Um, I also like to, depending on the age that they're at, sometimes you throw in, instead of doing a food as a reward, throw in a diversity challenge. So, for example, can we include, let's say we're trying to get more fruits and veggies in. This is Orange Week. In Orange Week, we're going to try and find 3 orange foods that we want to include in. So maybe that's going to be an orange, maybe it's going to be butternut squash, um, and maybe it's going to be a carrot, right? So we got 3 oranges this week. Next week we can do 3 greens or 3 blues. And that's a really fun way to try and get diversity, which isn't eat your vegetables or else. Um, I think a tool I used with a patient recently was we're going to do 2 whites and a color, right? So this child does well with cheese sticks, egg whites, and then we were looking for a fruit. So the child said pink and we included strawberries. So, we have to remember that kids and adults learn very different, where an adult can be more straight on. With kids, we have to get them involved and spark some of their motivation that way. Um, so we talked about involving kids in the selection process and then setting family goals that are feasible, even if it's cooking. Like I said, so I work with adults too. So I understand that, even sometimes just the meal planning process for adults can feel like a lot if you have kids and you're working and so on. So what is a realistic goal that is going to work for you that's also going to work for your child? How often, how much time can you spend in the kitchen? How can you make and acquire 4-minute meals that you know that your child is going to eat? I'll give you a meal planning hack in a minute that will help you guys. And then something that is so important, and this is something that I could stress 1005 times, is that consistency is important. And I want to give you examples. So the first is consistency follow-up, of course, with, let's say, the registered dietitian is important. The child is not going to change overnight. So implementing in the tools, if we're working on structured meals and snacks, then structured meal and snacks is what we're going to work on for a few weeks at a time. If we're working on decreasing added sugar, then we're going to consistently work on that over time, and we're going to follow up and we're going to make tweaks over time. So oftentimes I find, we, as the human brain starts really heavy and then over time we fall off. So consistency is, super important. So let's talk practical, right? If we were talking about raising healthy kids, what is it that we need to know about their diet? So do not skip breakfast. This is probably the most dietitian thing that I can say, but it's super important for children. I always say if I don't see them at lunchtime, I don't necessarily know what they're eating. So making breakfast a priority, and I'll tell you twofold. There is data that shows that having breakfast helps manage appetite and then manage caloric intake throughout the day. And the second thing is we want to focus on, if we can, breakfast that has nutrient density versus caloric density. So nutrient density means that we're getting a varied amount of nutrients, right? So we're getting our carbohydrates, our proteins, our fats, our fiber, where caloric density is calories. So let's say, for example, the child will have vanilla yogurt. Maybe we look for a vanilla yogurt that's not high in sugar. Maybe your swap for your kid is that they really like M&M yogurt, but they'll be really fine with Dannon vanilla yogurt that has less sugar. And then maybe we can add in like a lower sugar chocolate chip and strawberries versus having a quite sugary yogurt, right? Or maybe we can work on making oatmeal oatmeal, where what we're doing is we're starting with the simple oatmeal. We're getting a complex fiber. Kids need some carbs, and then we're going to build on that. We're going to add to it. Maybe we'll add, a serving of a milk next to it. Maybe we'll add some bananas in it, and so on. Also trying to promote things like eggs, avocado, small breakfast wraps, and so on. So we want to try and think about breakfast as brain food, but we also want to think about it as something that's going to stabilize the appetite throughout the day for the kids. And this may be a good challenge for you, is maybe your kid is like a cereal kid. That's totally okay. I totally understand. Maybe we can try and think about one real food breakfast, and you may have to get there in an untraditional way, changing out the yogurt, adding a fruit that they like, putting something familiar on the plate. But I don't think that we should skip breakfast, because I think it sets appetite up to be very variable later on in the day. Now, what should be on my kids' plate? So, you may have seen new dietary guidelines come out. Nothing changed in the pediatric world when it comes to dietary guidelines, and I find the My Plate to be, a relatively good starting point, because oftentimes I get like, I don't know what to put on my child's plate. How am I supposed to feed them? Now, I want you to think about this as an optimal plate, right? So let's say we're going to use a middle school. Maybe we'll use a sixth grade child in an example like this. What I would say is we're going to look for one protein, right? In volume, I mean, and every kid's different depending on sport level and so on. Usually I say make it the size of their little hand. One grain, right? And sometimes grains can be, let's say we're talking rice. This can be maybe the food that is consumed in excess, where we start between a half a cup. We probably start at a half a cup, maybe to 3/4 of a cup portion. And then we set the goal of trying to add a fruit and a veggie, right? So if we look for a protein, a grain, a fruit, and a veggie, this is a very balanced plate, and it's a good plate to start. You may be saying, that's crazy. How do I get all of these things on my kid's plate? Start with one and then work on getting the second, and then expand from there. Now, based off of the certain age of your child, there's maybe different iterations in the sense of how much carbohydrates, proteins, and energy that they require. But I think the simplest way to think about it is think about trying to make a balanced plate. Now, if I were to break down, make a balanced plate in an even more simplistic manner, this is how I would do it. I say to people, can you count to 4? 99% of the time they say yes. Every now and then someone says no, likely as a joke, right? But I say we want to make count to 4 meals. This works for kids. So what is a count to 4 meal? I find a taco to be a very friendly food. So if they're picky or if they're not picky, it's also something where we can change it up and we can add different proteins. So for example, step number 1 in count to 4 is you're going to add a protein source. So if we want to lean, meaning that it doesn't have a lot of saturated fat, maybe we'll go for a ground turkey or a ground chicken. Maybe we'll do a lean beef if we're looking to get a little bit more fat and iron in. But that's step number 1. So maybe your kid is like a big beef eater. Maybe we can try introducing a lean protein in. You're going to season it the same way. We don't recommend a lot of added sodium for kids. So you use a low sodium taco seasoning packet, and that's how you're going to, prepare your meat. Okay. Then step 2 is we're going to try and add a veggie, right? This may be the picky area. Maybe we're not getting a lot of veggies in. So that's where maybe you start with 1 piece of lettuce, or you start with little pico de gallo, or maybe you start with some small, cut up peppers, or do a little cauliflower rice. But this is something that I find that you can usually sneak into the meal, and the process of sneaking into the meal tends to be a little bit more, um, acceptable. Then we look at something like a taco shell, right? So there's so many different iterations of a taco shell. And this is where I like to talk about swaps, right? Where we can swap out for better things if we need to. So like a fiber-rich tortilla, if we're trying to get more fiber, if we're trying to decrease carbohydrate load in the diet, and so on. And then number four is our fats, right? So let's say in the context of a taco, it's avocado or reduced sodium cheese, and it's really just important to understand that fat sources calorically contribute a lot with little amounts, so we don't need a lot of them. But a taco, I find to be a pediatric safe food. I find that there's ways that we can swap things out for better versions. And it's familiar in taste. It's not so novelty where we're asking them to eat a spaghetti squash, which, if your kid's a good eater, could actually potentially be a fun thing to make a spaghetti squash bowl. But I like this counter four mentality. So maybe in the family meal planning, it's like, all right, let's try 2 count to 4 meals per week and see how we do with that. If we do well, then we can, move on and try something else. Now, after school snacks. This one is really, I would say, I like to say is my opinion. Um, but I like to make after school snacks for kids whole foods if we can, right? We're already sending them in their lunchbox with things that come in packages. We don't have to. Maybe your kid loves fruit and so on. But this after school snack should be just enough to give them the energy for what they need, but not suppress appetite for dinner and not provide high caloric contributions. So sometimes if I'm working on a kid with weight management, maybe it's that we're thinking about keeping these after school snacks, fresh foods, and maybe, I never talk about calories directly to children, but it may be that we want to keep the snack in the 150 calorie range in our brain when we're serving it to them, right? So maybe it's berries and string cheese. Maybe it's edamame, which is a fun one. They can put a little salt on it if they like that. And, either like a wheat cracker or an almond cracker. Maybe it's a small yogurt. I love like the no sugar chocolate chip yogurt because I think everybody loves that. Or maybe it's like a little yogurt bowl that they can make themselves. If you like baking and you want to get your kid in the kitchen with you, there's also alternative recipes, right? Where we can make better versions of the things that they really like: cookies, donuts, cottage cheese ice cream. Don't knock it till you try it. It actually can taste so good, right? So I think that smaller volumes to not suppress appetite are important. Don't think of snacks as just a big blend into dinner. And then if we can, this is a good opportunity to focus on whole foods. Sometimes I set the goal with my kid patients is, all right, let's try and make after school snack a whole food. We already had 2 things that were in the package that came into the lunchbox, which helps us with things like decreasing added sugar, and so on. Okay. Okay. So all foods fit, and I really do believe that. And something that I try and really emphasize with my patients is that, especially for kids, you're not going on a diet. This is going to be a sustainable lifestyle for you that is going to help make sure that we're keeping you really nice and healthy. So I get emails saying like, what do I do when I bring my kid to a birthday party? What do I do when they're eating out at someone else's house? And I really do believe in moderation. I think moderation is key to success in many different aspects of life. But we want to think about, having these foods in a way where we eat them, we don't feel uncomfortably full, and it doesn't feel like all or nothing. Like I can never have this at home, so let's go crazy on Halloween, or I can never have this at home, so let's overeat this when I'm outside of my traditional environment. So I really want to teach food balance and food moderation because oftentimes, especially from a psychological perspective, the more we feel like we can't have these things, the more we want to have them. So balance is key, and there is a way to incorporate, let's say, I hate saying it, like traditional junk foods. These are foods that your kids are exposed to, but we want to do it, of course, not all the time. And when they are around, we don't want to put too much weight to them, right? So that they don't feel so attractive. And when having them, thinking about having them in a way where we're not feeling overfull, we're feeling satisfied, we're having small amounts of these things. I'm more than happy to talk about that at the end if that's something that you guys are interested in. Now, physical activity, we have to get little bodies moving. We have to get all bodies moving, essentially. So, children, it's recommended to limit screen time Get 60 minutes of physical activity a day. If your kid's in sports, it's easy. If they're not, it's a little bit more complex. I always say that instead of just getting stuck on 60 minutes, is non-traditional ways to get movement in. Of course, playing with friends. If they're old enough, I tell them, make me a playlist of your 5 favorite songs and make a dance for me, or walk the dog, which parents always tend to like as an option. Of course, you have to go with them depending on the age. But thinking about it doesn't have to be so structured. And I like to try and say lead by example, and that one, of course, is really parent dependent. But seeing the joy of exercise in adults makes it something that potentially children want to do. Um, and then, like I said, we don't have to focus so heavy on 60, but keep the little bodies moving. Their little bodies are designed to move. I think, society wise, we don't move. We don't have to move as much. And, health is definitely, impacted by the inability of or sedentary lifestyles. So, I want to talk a little bit about sports, as many children are involved in different after school sports. And we want to think about sports in two ways, right? Of course, right, we're burning their exercise minutes. But of course, the more serious they get in the sport, or even if they don't get serious in the sport, right? What do you pack them before they go play their sport? Maybe it's dance, maybe it's like structured, like, um, you know, fall or spring sports, right? Before sports, we give them like, lower sugar granola bars. Maybe we're giving them an apple and some crackers. Maybe we're giving them like a little, I don't know, um, something drinkable and, maybe like a little made good wafer, right? And then post sport is when we want to optimize on protein and carbohydrates, um, so that their little bodies can recover the same way big bodies recover. Um, so this is sometimes I find that they may not be motivated by making healthy choices because becomes who cares, but they may be more motivated by their sport or their interest. And sometimes if we can tap into their interest and they realize that they're making dietary changes, not just for their, you know, physical bodies, but it will help them in another area of their life that they feel good in, they tend to do a little bit better. And I think part of my final message, for this talk is get in tune, with your body. So this is one of the principles of intuitive eating, which is using a hunger fullness scale, which I think with a adolescent brain that is old enough to comprehend what the scale is, it can be a really good tool. So I want to kind of briefly explain it to you, right? So if we think about our hunger and our fullness, oftentimes we're very disconnected from that. But we go from starving mode to super full mode, right? And we understand starving mode doesn't feel good. Super full mode also doesn't feel good. Satisfied and full feels good, right? So how do I use the scale? A few ways. If your kid decided that eating lunch isn't cool, um, and they come off the bus and they're ravenously hungry, they might be irritable. They may start acting, up in a certain way, right? So starting to connect that to the scale, connecting that behavioral issue is a hunger issue, right? Or let's say they're snacking or they're over snacking. What does full belly feel like? Does it not feel good? We don't want to get to that point. I always like to say Goldilocks, which your kids probably wouldn't know, but right, not too hungry, not too full, right in the middle point. So we want to create Goldilocks kids that understand that nutrition is all about that middle ground place where they feel really good. They don't feel too hungry. They don't feel too full. Um, and I think that's all I have. We can go into Q&A. So thank you guys so much for listening. Um, like I said, my name is Alexandra. You guys can find me Concierge Basement. You can follow me on Instagram if you don't, at Nutrition by Dr. Alexandra. Email me if you have questions. But let's jump into some questions. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Filingeri. That was fantastic. There was tons of practical information, and I think your count to four idea just made Taco Tuesdays a whole lot better. Definitely did in my house. All right, let's hit the Q&A. A lot of you submitted questions in advance, so let's kick that off with first one. Let's talk about toddlers and keeping the sugar in their diet at a reasonable level. Can you touch upon that again?
Yeah. So I think it really comes down to looking at the label, right, of what it is that we're going to give them. and looking for alternatives. So like we said, your kid is going to request this pouch and this yogurt and you know that snack food, but there are better versions. So I gave a really good example. If they really love M&M yogurt, which is so popular in pediatrics, they can probably switch to a Dannon vanilla, and then add in like a a reduced sugar type of M&M, right? So they're alone. It's just a suitable swap for them. Same thing with the cereals. So let's say they're like lovers of Lucky Charms. What I would say is, okay, we want to try and look for, cereals that are similar but different, right? So they don't have as much added sugar. Also, we want to think about it, especially with toddlers, is, decide what level of sugar you feel comfortable giving them. If you decide that it's one mega added sugar snack a day, then that's the tone that we're going to try and follow each day. That's where I said like consistency is so important. Um, because, of course, like they'll keep asking, but if the tone is one a day, then we look for suitable swaps after the one a day.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think that also plays into the you don't have to play all or nothing as far
Right.
as that goes. All right, let's jump to tweens and teens. 9-year-old girls embracing that everyone kind of has a different body. And in particular, when those young girls get their period, is there anything they can consider to help them with extra bloating during that time?
So, I think it's twofold. First is kind of just explaining to them, like just from a body standpoint, right? Like they're starting to get comfortable in what their maturing body is like. So explaining that bloating around a menstrual cycle is a very normal thing. And it's not something to feel embarrassed about. And it's something that, you know, their peers and their parents and so on are going to go through. Um, so I think first is just having the conversation, making it a little bit more, knowing that this is going to happen and it's okay. It's supposed to happen. We're not supposed to feel perfect 24/7. From a nutritional standpoint in adolescence, I would be hesitant to say make dietary changes. It may be, and this, I see this sometimes, it may be like during that menstrual cycle period, they're looking for a lot of sweets, or they're finding themselves having a lot of snack foods. And then it really becomes that principle of moderation in the sense of maybe we find better swaps for really sugary snacks, fiber-esque foods to help with bowel movements if they're feeling constipation during that side of their that time in their menstrual cycle.
That makes a lot of sense. And we have an adjacent question that I think you touched upon already, but maybe we could just double tap on it with kids and their own body image and perception. I know you were talking about how to stay healthy without avoiding diet, without dipping into diet culture. Anything to say on the perception of bodies?
Yeah. Well, first off, I think it's such a hard world that adults are living in. So putting kids in it, especially with social media, is really, really tough. I think it's twofold. Of course, it's just I always say to my patients, they come in and they're showing me these TikToks and that, and I always tell them like you have to filter what you're looking at. We can't be exposed to such negative, body images online because it's not good for us. I think that secondarily, of course, it is having that conversation with them, to make them understand that everybody is a little bit different and that's okay. And then if it really the body image you start to see is becoming a big problem, don't watch and wait, act. That's when I think like it's therapy could be, and not even just nutritional therapy, psychological therapy could be such an amazing tool, right? Usually if you see red flags in your kid's body image and eating habits, you see them starting to manipulate how they're eating. Don't assume it's going to go away. It's likely not. It's a good area. At least bring it up with the pediatrician, and see if they think that a second step isn't necessary.
Solid advice. That's actually a great point about the pediatrician. I mean, I think everyone here probably already knows, but your pediatrician is your partner. And that's, at Concierge Pediatrics, we always say your pediatrician is your quarterback. Turn to your pediatrician, ask those questions. That's how we partnered with Dr. Ali in the first place to make sure that we could provide those resources to kids. So, right on. Let's go back to the toddler age. Someone submitted and said, my toddler loves to eat. He's in the 90th percentile. How do I make sure he isn't overeating and creating bad habits for the future?
Yeah. So the structured piece is so important, right? In the sense of breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks are intentional, right? So maybe it's the fact that it's not 3 snacks a day anymore. If they're very high on their growth grid for weight, maybe it's 2 snacks per day with meals in between. Um, I think that that's a good starting place. It may also be like, if you and your husband or wife are on the bigger side, like, and maybe your child is just trending higher in growth, which is important. But structure, right? And then taking out sneaky calories, right? Things that you can eat a little bit of, but have a lot of calories, right?
Mm.
And that's a lot of kid foods is you don't have to eat a lot of it, but calorically it's super rich. So trying to remove those things from the diet first, before even looking at the portion sizes of the meals.
Put you on the spot, but could you give a couple of examples of the sneaky calories? I
Oh
like
yeah.
that term. I think that's interesting.
So like if we're talking like let's say we're going to just talk about like a small thing of French fries, right?
Mm.
Not only are we getting carbohydrates, but they're fried in oils. So they're very rich in saturated fat, right? So we're getting carbs and fat, a lot of fat. So that is going to be one food, even muffins, right? So if we're looking at foods
Oh,
that
yeah.
traditionally I characterize a muffin as a carb, if we look at the back of the muffin has a lot of butter in it. So not only is it a carb, but it's a carb and a fat source, right? So oftentimes it's those foods that double combine, and it's typically carbs and fat that tend to be calorically high. Things like candy, they may not be high calorie, but we may see, whoa, it's, you know, 20 grams of sugar. Another one is drinks, beverages.
Mm.
So pediatric recommendations is, avoid as much added sugar as possible. The juices add up, right? Those are your liquid calories. They're not creating any type of fullness or satiety. So those are things that we want to be careful as well, like the liquids that we're taking in and the types of snack foods that we're taking in. I gave another example, and these are good calories, but beef versus turkey or chicken, right?
Right.
Just the fat content is going to make one more calorically rich and the one not as much.
Yeah. All right. Makes a lot of sense. Thanks for those tips. Those were good. I always forget that muffins are, and when you get
And
like a
listen, I'm
jumbo
not a
muffin.
muffin hate. I'm not a muffin hater. Like I think that they're great. It's just something I was lecturing my college students last semester, and there was like a really old graphic from the 90s that was great, and it showed that something as simple as a French fry can have 18 grams of fat. If we look at a kid, right, where their weight, they only may weigh 30 or 40 pounds, 18 grams of fat in French fries far exceeds their daily fat amount.
Yeah.
Um,
Got to make some decisions there. All right, let's go back to the little babies who are starting to introduce solids. What types of healthy foods should be introduced when introducing solids to a baby?
So protein foods, right? And the reason is because we're looking for protein. We're also looking for iron, as well.
Okay.
So first protein, soft protein foods. Following soft protein foods, traditionally you can do um, veggies and then fruits. Usually they like sweets first, right? In general, like all brains, like doesn't matter how old the brain is. So usually it's protein foods, veggies, and fruits. Iron fortified cereals can also count when it comes to meeting their needs. You may find that your kid that you're introducing solids to is doing so amazing during solids. Then they become 2 years old and they decide that they only like French fries, and then it becomes tricky. So like nutritional needs will change at each stage of development that they're in.
Is that something to consider with you said the babies, people, I suppose, naturally gravitate towards sweets. Is sweets or even fruits something you should probably introduce like last? Is there an order of operations in the introduction of solids?
I don't think textbook necessarily. It's really protein foods and iron fortified foods first. Of course, just from like a growth and development standpoint, I wouldn't necessarily say like you cannot give your kid, fruits. You
Yeah.
100% can. They have high nutritional quality, especially now is in like a lot of like the baby foods and like the pouches. There's so many brands that are like cleaner versions. They usually combine fruits and veggies, so it tends to not be so big of an issue.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. All right, I think we're on our last one here. Um, let's talk about supplements and or multivitamins. Is concentrating on diet more effective than using those? What's your thoughts?
So it's twofold, right? So I don't. give anybody a prophylactic, which just means everybody gets it just in case multivitamin, but it's under the direction of the pediatrician. Usually during growth and development, they become picky eaters, and a multivitamin is good to start, right? So I would say talk to your pediatrician. There's no problem in taking a pediatric version of a multivitamin. But thinking about a multivitamin filling in the gaps for diet, we're missing certain things. So, for example, fiber. You can get all your B vitamins in multivitamins, but you don't get dietary fiber, right? So, if you're dealing with constipation, the multivitamin isn't necessarily going to help you with that. It's also not going to help develop those better eating habits around taking in fruits and vegetables. So, no problem with multivitamin. Another one that I see is iron deficiency. Of course, if they're not taking in iron rich foods, and that always starts with the lab evaluation of the pediatrician, right? Where the supplementation may be a fine first place to start. But I personally believe that no supplements should enter into a little tiny body with a little tiny liver before it's cleared. Is there a deficiency or is there something that we need to correct? Talked to the MD doctor and then talk to the RD, and I'm happy to give you like 45 versions of a brand that I like.
That makes sense. That's really good advice. All right. Well, 8:44. I think we've covered it all. So, Dr. Filingeri, thank you so much for your insights. We're so grateful to have you as an extension of the Concierge Pediatrics team. Thank you to all of our guests here who've taken the time out of your schedules to join us. We hope this was helpful to you. Don't leave yet. We're going to be sending around a quick questionnaire at the end of this webinar. It'll pop up on screen. We'd really love to hear your feedback. It means so much to us. We want to continue doing these types of events. We want to make them useful. We want to make them meaningful to you. So your commentary is incredibly important for us as we move forward in this process. If you want to stay connected to Dr. Filingeri, you can follow her on Instagram at nutrition by underscore Dr. Dr. Alexandra. So it's nutrition by underscore Dr. Alexandra. I think it's about time to close out the session. Dr. Filingeri, any last thoughts?
That's it, guys. Thank you for coming and listening on your 8 p.m. on what day of the week is it? On your Thursday. Um, and yeah, I'm happy I got to have this chat with you all.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, have a very good night. And if you're in New York and New Jersey, stay safe in the snow.